All right. Hi, I'm Christina Bellantoni. I am the assistant managing editor for politics at the Los Angeles Times, and I do lots of work with USC. And even though I'm a Berkeley grad, I managed to come here to USC all the time and was just here for Festival of Books over the weekend. So thanks, everyone, for being here. Hope it's been a great conference. I have actually been on maternity leave. I'm just finishing it up and going back to work next week. So it's been really interesting for me to sort of absorb President Trump's first 100 days, not covering it and looking at not just what the LA Times has been doing, but what my colleagues have been doing, and all of the analysis here. I think it's going to be really important for everybody at this marker. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce this esteemed panel, and I will try to keep these quick. You know who a lot of these fabulous people are, but starting with Robert English. He is an associate professor of international relations here at UC Dornsife, and he previously served as a policy analyst for the Department of Defense. Joel Pollak, am I pronouncing that correctly? Great. He's the senior editor at large for an in-house counsel for Breitbart. He also is the author of a book that you guys may have seen out there, and that is called How Trump Won: The Inside Story of a Revolution. Laurie Brand is the Robert Grandford Wright Professor of International Relations and Middle East Studies here at UC Dornsife. John Emerson is the former U.S. ambassador to Germany, serving from 2013 to 2017, and he was working with the Clinton White House from 1993 to 1997 as deputy assistant. And Todd Purdum, fellow journalist and senior writer, political correspondent for Vanity Fair and Politico, and he had served as the LA bureau chief and White House correspondent for the New York Times. So I think it does kind of make sense to start with a grade of President Trump, and I'd love everybody to weigh in on this, but specifically, how you would grade President Trump's first 100 days on foreign policy, and if you can be specific, something that he has done exceptionally well and something that you think could have been handled better. And for now, I'll start with Professor English.
Oh my gosh. I decided that I would try to dodge the question, at least the way you put it when it was sent to me in advance, because, well, it's easy to say it's too early to give grades, but obviously we do have some initial steps. But the second was, I'm not sure that we agree on the template for grading. And what I have in mind here is simply, if, as probably most of the political elite believes, a good grade, movement in the right direction, would be a return from expressing admiration for Putin, and optimism about working together, and skepticism about traditional policy alliances and so forth, to turn away from that and come back to the center, then what we've seen so far, although it's ephemeral, and Donald Trump is nothing if not protean and inconstant, nonetheless should be encouraging, right? And just to remind the audience what we're speaking about, there's been less praise of Putin, although there was never much except saying he's a strong leader, but that still irritated people greatly. They thought there should be a lot of criticism. In its place, there has been some criticism, especially with regard to his support of Assad in Syria. There was the declaration that, no, NATO is not obsolete after all. And indeed, following through with the policy begun under the previous administration of reinforcing and upgrading these brigades, our military presence in Poland and the Baltics. What else? The cruise missile strike on Syria, on the airfield from which it's alleged the chemical weapons attack occurred a week earlier, something that seems to have infuriated the Russians, something that, after all, again, Assad is their ally, and this is something they had warned against doing, escalating, intervening. The list could go on. I guess I would close with the most recent, which was the denial of a waiver for ExxonMobil to proceed with another round of this joint venture, this joint exploration project that had been, signed and begun before the outbreak of conflict in Ukraine. And so ExxonMobil wanted a waiver to go forward, and they were denied. So those who want to see Trump return to the center, traditional foreign policy, are also, of course, heartened by the departure of General Flynn, the apparently lessened influence of Stephen Bannon. But Beyond that, I don't know what to make of it, and my grade is so provisional. We've got like 5% of the coursework in here. I probably shouldn't go on at great length, but if you'll give me one more minute, I'd say the following. I'm waiting to see, most importantly, what comes from the both the House and Senate Intelligence Committee investigations and the ongoing FBI inquiry into the possibility of collusion with Russian intelligence, with the Russian government, in the election itself, the hacking and then timing of the release of emails in order to maximally embarrass the Clinton campaign. You've all been following those. Without prejudging what might come out of them, although I would say so far lots of smoke, not much fire, everything hinges on that. And never before, in my memory, has Russia policy in the U.S. been so intimately tied with what happens in American domestic politics and with what happens in Washington. It's impossible to assess what he's doing out there independently of what's happening in D.C. If those investigations produce a smoking gun, then everything changes. But if, in fact, all we find are that General Flynn didn't declare this speaking fee and Carter Page has money stashed away from some honorarium in the Cayman Islands, and you know, Manafort took money from this oligarch and did political consulting for that shady guy. If, in other words, it's a series of scandals or misdeeds of the magnitude, let's say, of the stuff we saw after the Iraq invasion and the reconstruction and the no-bid Halliburton contracts and the rest, well, that's bad, but it wouldn't necessarily completely tie Trump's hands in seeking at a later date to change direction with Russia and try to find some accord on Syria, some kind of deal to end the Ukraine conflict. If, however, they are compromised that deeply, we're talking about impeachment and much else, and nothing will change with Russia policy while that's underway. That's a lot more probably than you wanted, but now I'll be quiet.
And a nice groundwork for the things we're going to be discussing today. You've touched on a lot of the really big issues with Trump's foreign policy. And I should point out we'll also be taking your questions from the audience as well at the conclusion of our panel. Joel, I imagine you might have a slightly different assessment.
So I'll answer your grade question. I would give Trump an A in foreign policy. And I would do that because he has been singularly effective in foreign policy in a way he has been in no other area of his presidency. If you look at the things he has struggled to do, most of them have been in areas where he's either been stifled by Congress, its lack of preparation or discord among Republicans, or by the courts, where there's been a lot of forum shopping in the opposition to various executive orders, and so he's been running up against the other branches of government, which, by the way, is how our system is supposed to work. But in foreign policy, the president has a fairly free hand, and there he's been very effective. One of the most important things, and I wrote this before the election, that it's important for the next president to do is to restore America's strategic advantage, which had declined over the course of the Obama years, also somewhat over the Bush years for different reasons. With Bush, there was a diplomatic decline as a result of the mess in Iraq, but with Obama, there was almost a calculated decline with the slow attrition of the military, the leading from behind strategy, the restoration of relations with rogue regimes. All of this served to undercut America's effectiveness and strength on the world stage. And Trump, remarkably, I think, in the first 100 days, has reestablished the leverage of the United States dealing with great powers, not just small countries, but with adversaries, potentially. There have been some surprises. He has been friendlier towards China. But it's easier to be friendly when you're bombing Syria over a piece of chocolate cake. I mean, he's used different aspects of his foreign policy, like the Syrian airstrikes, in order to advance a policy agenda with China that is about much more than the Middle East, and certainly not even primarily about the Middle East, but about trade and about North Korea. So I think that he's been very effective there, and that unpredictability is the only way to claw back some of that strategic advantage that was lost over the last decade. When you can't build up your military and your Navy very quickly, although he said he's wanted to do it, not much has been done yet on that in the first 100 days. It takes a long time. These procurement contracts take forever to sort out. So he's not going to be able to build up to that 300-ship Navy he wants anytime soon. But in the meantime, he can regain some of the advantage by being unpredictable. There are some criticisms of his foreign policy from conservatives, and they basically fall into two categories. The one criticism is that he's starting to follow the path of George W. Bush by engaging in the Middle East. That was an early criticism that happened right after the Syrian airstrikes. There was a contingent of Trump supporters who felt that he was being swayed by various advisors and so on. By the way, it's very difficult to know what the advisors are saying. I don't think anyone can presume to know on foreign policy, for example, what Steve Bannon's views are. I mean, I know Steve very well. His views thus far, I would guess, line up very closely with those of the Trump administration in terms of its actions. On domestic policy, you can probably point to one or two fights that it looks like perhaps Steve lost. But on foreign policy, I haven't seen anything personally that I would imagine is at odds with Steve's own beliefs. So it's very hard to read the tea leaves in terms of who's having what discussions. And so I don't even bother. I just look at what the president does. So some people were very afraid that he was marching into Syria, and there was this talk about regime change. But it was couched very carefully in terms of the 2012 Geneva Agreement and continuing certain aspects of previously existing policies. And so the Trump administration was very careful to say after those airstrikes, we're not sending lots of ground troops there to do whatever. ISIS is the first priority, and the regime change stuff comes later through a managed diplomatic process. So they kind of mollified that for a while. The other criticism comes from within the pro-Israel community, and I do some writing about Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And there was this sense when Trump took office that anything was possible, that this terrible relationship that had come about over 8 years with Obama, this deterioration of ties between the two governments, could be reversed. But more than that, that Trump could really reset the chessboard in the Middle East. And there's some criticisms that he's fallen back on patterns of previous administrations, for example, by prioritizing an Israeli-Palestinian peace accord. That's something every administration has done and has failed to achieve, largely. I mean, we can get into the reasons why. I don't want to start an argument. We have many things to argue about. Let's not add that to the list. But so the people who are worried now that he's relying on advisors who are more moderate, and who's this Gary Cohn person, and what does Jared Kushner know, and who's this person who worked for Condoleezza Rice, and so on and so on. The Trump administration is relying on people with experience from previous administrations, and there is some concern among conservatives who supported him when nobody else would, that he's lost some of the initial edge, some of that initial, if you want, the power of surprise that he had. Because when he came into office, nobody knew anything. I mean, the Palestinians didn't know who to call. They didn't have a phone number for anybody in the White House, and so they panicked for several weeks before somebody reached out to them. And this was the case for many people. I remember I was covering an event with the Australian ambassador a few days after Trump won, and they just did not know what to make of it, and they were trying to put as brave a face on it as possible, because there were comments that had been made by Australian politicians that were very negative towards Trump, and now they were having to walk all these things back. And Australia is a very close ally, but they were very nervous about the damage that they had potentially done to the relationship with the new administration through all the things they had said during the campaign. So given that uncertainty, there was a moment where Trump was expected to do all these unbelievable things. But the thing about Trump is he defies expectations, and you can understand his behavior by understanding almost everything he does is a negotiating process. And I write a lot about negotiation, and I'd have to say that in the major foreign policy thrust of his administration, he's done everything a good negotiator would do to obtain better results, more leverage, and ultimately the outcomes he wants to achieve. So I would give him an A, and as you say, incomplete, lots still to do. But I read it less in terms of flip-flops and turnabouts, and more just in terms of every administration being unprepared for the actual foreign policy problems it encounters when it gets to office. And I think his negotiating instincts have guided him very well so far.
Professor Brand.
So I think I'll follow my professor colleague who sort of declined to give a grade. It seems perhaps an odd thing for us to do. You said an incomplete, Rob. So yeah, I would prefer not to do that. You had asked us, Christina, if we could talk about one thing that we think has been done especially well and one thing that hasn't been done particularly well. I'd also, as Rob did, sort of rephrase it a bit and just say a couple of things where there has actually been a pullback from positions that were staked out during the campaign, and that I see the pullback or the revision of position as being a positive. And so there are two primary ones. I mean, I limit myself to that because we're limited in terms of time. The two things that candidate Trump promised to do, I believe he promised to do both of them on day one, but there were a lot of things that were promised on day one. And neither of them have been done, and I think that it's very important. One was the promise to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This is not an uncommon promise. It's made during U.S. presidential campaigns, and then it's one which is always backed away from. There was a law that was passed, I believe it was in 1994, which required the transferal of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, but it offered the president, the sitting president, a 6-month waiver, or the opportunity to exercise a 6-month waiver if he or she someday perhaps, feels it to be in the U.S. interest. And so in any case, this was one of the things that I think many pro-Israel supporters thought was very important, that he was making this claim, that he was making this promise. This is something he's backed away from. I think that's an important change because I don't think that it contributes at all to improving U.S. relations in the region. It certainly would not have gotten any attempted discussions about future Palestinian-Israeli relations off, at least with the United States involved, to a particularly good start. So I think that's an important shift. The other was that the president also promised that on the first day he was going to tear up the nuclear accord with Iran, and he's backed away from that. It was interesting in the lead up to the inauguration, and then immediately thereafter, as we learned who his appointees would be for major national security or foreign policy posts, and then heard them as they began to make public statements, that there was a real difference, clearly, among the various foreign policy actors. And we had Tillerson and Mattis in particular, I think, who in various ways said that we needed to wait and see. Mattis, who I believe said something to the effect of, the United States has signed an agreement. We have to show people that the United States won't back away from its agreements. We're going to watch the Iranians very closely. We're going to make sure that they hold to what they promised. But there was no movement forward to, in effect, tear up the agreement. That's happened, I think, to the consternation, particularly of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who are really hoping that Trump would move forward on that front and take a much more aggressive anti-Iran position. Trump himself has, just recently made a statement saying that he felt that Iran was not keeping to the spirit of the accord, but there's been a back away from tearing it up. Now, things that could have been handled better, I have a whole laundry list, but I'll limit myself to two. One, and it has to do with the president's decision to congratulate Erdogan in Turkey for his winning the election. The referendum, I'm sorry, the recent referendum. This, for those of you who follow Turkey, for those of you who may not be following it terribly closely, this was basically a referendum on gutting whatever remained of Turkish democracy. Turkey has, for the last several years, by analysts, according to analysts who've been watching it far more closely than I, although I monitor it as part of my work with an academic freedom committee. Turkey has taken what was called an authoritarian turn. That's become increasingly severe since last January, and what can only be called, I think, purges have taken place in various parts of the Turkish state, in the civil service, and also in the universities. It's been a hollowing out, I think, of just some of Turkey's best and brightest. People dismissed from positions. Many people can't travel. They've had their passports canceled. They're not allowed to work. And this then goes along with all sorts of additional, human rights violations, the muffling or the complete crackdown on Turkish press. It's been dreadful. And while it's one thing for an administration to decide that it's not going to use human rights advocacy as one of its positions, it's another thing to actively come out and support with someone who is clearly turning Turkey into a police state. The second thing I would mention, which doesn't have to do with my normal kind of regional realm, or specifically with that, which is the Middle East, concerns the executive order that the president signed to ban federal money going to international groups that perform or even provide information about abortion. This is dreadful. It handicaps organizations abroad in a way which is not even true in the United States. It means that organizations can't even talk to a woman about abortion provisions, about various forms of contraception. So this is, its impact. I mean, if the president was moved by the dreadful sight of Syrian men, women, children who have been gassed with sarin, then we need to think also about the number of women who will die from illegal or unsafe abortions as a result of the direct impact, and there are plenty of studies that demonstrate this from this executive order.
I'll just add a follow-up question to that. That was Barack Obama's first action as president, was to reinstate this that President Bush had pulled. So is there a demonstrable effect, or was there when Obama signed it, reversing what Bush had been doing? There
have been studies conducted which show what the impact is of the lack of access to this kind of information and these sorts of services abroad. So.
Interesting. Ambassador Emerson.
Thank you, and I also want to thank Bob Shrum and his team for putting all this together and inviting us here today. Okay, two things that he's done well. Number one, Mattis and McMaster, the two key elements of the national security team, have proven to be terrific appointments and have really, I think, begun to move the national security apparatus in a positive direction, in stark contrast to what we were looking at during the transition and with the 3 weeks when General Flynn was in charge. The second thing is, I actually think that after a disastrous start with regard to his relationship with foreign leaders, the stumbling over the two-China policy, incendiary comments and insults directed towards Angela Merkel, and yelling at the Australian Prime Minister and then hanging up on him on the phone, I think Donald Trump is actually beginning to do a pretty good job of building good personal relationships with foreign leaders. And I will tell you that Angela Merkel's top people will confirm that that relationship is being built, and they see that as an important and a valuable thing. Those are relatively small items, though, when you consider the concerns. It's great to try to build upon or take advantage of America's strategic advantage, but you need to have a strategy to do that. And as Joel indicated, virtually everything that Donald Trump does is part of a negotiating process. And his strategy is purely transactional. And this can lead to problems. And a great example of this is when you have on a Monday, Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, who really hadn't been heard from all that much until this point, gives a speech demonstrating or outlining what was a clear departure from not just the consensus in the Obama administration, the bipartisan consensus in the Obama administration, but also the consensus with our allies, that the only solution to the civil war in Syria is a political solution that does not have Assad in charge of the country at the end of the day. And Tillerson gets up and says, you know what, whether Assad is involved or not is going to be up to the Syrian people. And this comes in the wake of all the, warm and fuzzies that up until that time had been directed towards Vladimir Putin, which is obviously Assad's, Russia and Iran, Assad's major patrons. So should we be shocked that 4 days later Assad, violated the agreement that he made to destroy and not use chemical weapons, to then drop chemical weapons? Now, Assad's a bad guy. I'm not going to give him an excuse that, oh, well, the Trump people gave me the opportunity to do this, because he's been dropping barrel bombs and cluster bombs and all that forever, which are, war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I'm not trying to give him that excuse. But the point is, then the day after, you have Tillerson getting up and saying, well, no, actually now Assad has to be gone. And I agree they walked it back a little bit, as Joel pointed out, but, or maybe Robert, you pointed that out. But in any event, this is a problem. When you don't have any kind of strategic thinking and everything's being done on the ad hoc, case-by-case basis, you run into problems like this. And another illustration of this is a complete lack of understanding of the power and the necessity for diplomacy. And the fact that the Trump budget represents an issue is going to be a 30%. Now it's an 18% cut in the budget of the State Department and the Agency for International Development, which candidly, so much of the work that they do ultimately helps to stabilize this unstable world in which we're living, to the point that General Mattis, the beneficiary of these cuts, because most of this money is going to go to the military, says, that's fine, you're just going to have to buy me more bullets. And Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, embraces these cuts, which demonstrates to me that General Mattis has a better understanding of the role of a Secretary of State than our current Secretary of State does. This is a problem. And again, it reflects a lack of broader strategic thinking. The final point I'll make that I think is a significant problem for the administration is I believe in the first 3 months that Donald Trump has done a very good job of squandering what is literally the most important asset that any president of the United States has when it comes to foreign policy, and that's presidential credibility. When you start tweeting about and promoting far-out conspiracy theories or unproven or flat-out false statements and accusations, you undermine the credibility of your office and you undermine the credibility of what you say. So let's say we're going to probably talk more about this with the Iran nuclear deal. Let's say that Iran does more than what it typically does. What it typically does, just so you know, is they always walk right up to the edge of violating that thing, and then we have to pull them back. And this, by the way, happens on a weekly basis. It is a lot of work to kind of keep that deal moving forward as it has been, which is good. But let's say they violate it. Now, yeah, that was a 6-country deal, right? You had the Chinese, the Russians, the Germans, the French, the Brits, and the Americans negotiating with the Iranians. And you got the other allies, they like this deal. Now, if President Trump, who, by the way, spent a good deal of his transition denigrating the intelligence community and the quality of the information that they get, and spends time saying that the press is the enemy and that anything that he doesn't like is fake news. So now how is he going to go to his allies and say, you know what, we got intelligence that shows that the Iranians are violating this agreement and we need to walk it back and we need to reimpose sanctions? You think they're going to believe him? That's a problem. So I would give him, you know, I would have given him a D-. I think given a couple of things that have happened that Robert talked about, getting a little bit more clear-eyed about Russia. I personally agreed with, you know, with the action that was taken in Syria. I think one of the mistakes Obama made was announcing a red line and then not following through on that. So I was glad to see that happen. And I am very pleased to see, you know, the work that Mattis and McMaster is doing, and they're getting very, very good reviews. You know, so, you know, maybe he's up to a D+ or a C-. But these issues, lack of any kind of comprehensive strategy, everything is not transactional. You've got to be thinking more broadly than that. And the absolute deterioration of presidential credibility are two very, very serious problems.
Todd, your grade.
Well, it's always great to go last because everyone's stolen your answers already. But John, in particular, I would have said that 2 of the good things were General McMaster and General Mattis. I mean, General McMaster wrote a marvelous book, among other things, about Vietnam. But in response to the question about the grade, we journalists are taught several things, one of which is to, at all costs, as Sean Spicer learned, avoid Nazi analogies. And at the New York Times, I would say we were also taught to avoid things like letter grades for politicians because it seems tendentious. But I think it's a cliche, but you could say that President Trump has an incomplete or an eye for inchoate at this point, because I do think the policy has been situational, anecdotal, responsive to day-to-day events. It's hard to see what's consistent about it from day to day. I'd agree with the professors that from a perspective of, you know, mainstream 60, 70 years of American foreign policy, the changes he's made since taking office have been to the good. That is, have been in the broad range of the bipartisan consensus that has prevailed by and large in American foreign policy since the end of World War II. And I think, you know, as people who live in a dangerous world, we can all be grateful for that he has in fact adopted a more conventional foreign policy tone overall. I think you could say that in general, the personnel in the national security team, and that would include people like Dina Powell, who had worked in the George W. Bush administration, is on a far superior plane to the personnel in the domestic policy staff or the internal domestic staff of the White House. And these people could have served in any administration in the last 10 or 20 years, I think. Either General Masters or General McMaster's or General Mattis could easily have worked for President Obama, and I think that that's a very good sign for the continuity and stability of foreign policy. I agree with John that the cuts in the State Department budget and the budget for diplomacy in general are alarming, as is Secretary Tillerson's seeming lack of interest in defending his own, not just bureaucratic turf, but his own mission. When Colin Powell was Secretary of State and I used to cover the department, he liked to say that the personnel of the State Department doesn't amount to even a single division in the Army. And he was constantly outgunned and outmanned around the world in terms of being able to do the work he was trying to do in the aftermath of 9/11 especially, and handling the situation in the run-up to the Iraq War and the aftermath of it. And so I think, you know, as General Mattis said, soft power is more important than ever in this world, and it doesn't make you soft on foreign policy to be an advocate for soft power. It doesn't make you soft on the national security interests of the United States. It makes you smart. I guess, just to be brief, I would say that a whole range of other disappointing things involve the Trump administration and President Trump's and his family's unwillingness to untangle, disentangle the complicated web of obvious conflicts of interest they have all over the world, including the rampant uptick in the number of trademarks he's seeking in China and other places. There's a story in the New York Times just this afternoon about Jared Kushner's family's ties to diamond interests that are under international investigation in 4 countries. And I don't know Jared Kushner. He seems, obviously like a fine person, but what he brings to the table, or what he knows in terms of being able to solve the riddle of Mideast peace, or deal as the point person on international relations or China, or you name it, in places where, among other things, his family might have complex and interrelated commercial interests, I think should be troubling to any American. So I think that that's one thing that has also undermined the president's credibility. Why is he doing what he's doing? Is he doing this because it benefits him, because it benefits the country, because it's the right thing to do for the world in which we're living? I think his continual refusal to disclose his taxes, to really disentangle himself from his own business affairs. And I understand that it's very hard for him because he is the business. It's not as if he's the chief executive of a public company that he can, and if he were, by the way, or even if he were the chief executive of something like Goldman Sachs, when Hank Paulson became the Treasury Secretary, he told me that if he had really understood what it was going to take in terms of resolving conflicts of interest, making huge financial sacrifices of future earnings and payouts, he probably would have headed right back to Wall Street. But by that, he'd already said, by that time, I'd already said yes to President Bush. And I think it is, I'll grant you that it's complicated in the case of President Trump, because he is his whole business, and he is his brand. It's not as if he can just walk away from something. If he walked away from it, it would cease to exist because he is it. So I understand that, but I think there easily could have been, and yet might be, creative, thoughtful ways in which he and his family, if they're willing, can really make a cleaner break with some of these questions, and make people have greater confidence in what's happening in his dealings around the world.
Thank you. So we've touched, a few of you have touched on this in different ways. The question of whether there's a strategy coming from the Trump White House right now and the Trump administration, state to defense, on all of these seemingly unrelated things, the destabilization of the Korean Peninsula, the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan, what we're seeing in Europe right now. And yes, we could go on and on. So I guess I'd like everybody to just mix it up. Do we think that President Trump is approaching this with a strategy, or are these just a series of unrelated events happening all at once?
Well, you heard me on it, so somebody else should counter that maybe.
Yeah, it's the same question President Reagan faced. He was asked what his strategy was. He said, we win, they lose. That's the strategy. Whatever you have to do to win. And what Trump is showing us is that there are many more tools in the toolbox than we had previously thought. I mean, I agree with the comments about soft power, But the Obama administration took it to such an extreme. You know, we had this hashtag campaign for various foreign policy events. I mean, it became a joke. So soft power is fine, but not to the point of losing any structure whatsoever. And I think that this administration has shown remarkable flexibility in terms of the way it's willing to use elements of soft power together with hard power. The fact that it is constantly unpredictable is good. You don't simply want to be unpredictable, you also need to be effective. But I think that is part of the strategy of getting the United States to a position where we succeed in reducing threats to our security, and we succeed in improving our access to foreign markets and shifting the economic gains in some of our trade relations back towards the United States.
You know, the problem with we win, they lose is, which sounds great. I mean, who doesn't like that, right? The problem with we win, we lose is what happens after we win. So we won the war in Iraq. Saddam Hussein's gone. Did we really win? When you look at what's happened subsequent to that? So you need to have a broader thinking about the ultimate consequences of things, which, by the way, we didn't have. Again, I'm an equal opportunity criticizer. I mean, we didn't have that when the Obama administration and the Allies went into Libya. You know, there wasn't enough thought given to, which is, by the way, why President Obama decided not to go into Syria, because he said, I don't know what happens the day after, and we need to understand that. And to effectively win the peace, or win the victory, or consolidate the victory, whatever phrase you want to use, you often need very proactive, thoughtful diplomacy, working with our allies to accomplish that.
One of my own. Okay, so one question I'm often asked when people are sort of assessing what's happening right now is, you know, we live here in Los Angeles. Should we be concerned about what's happening in North Korea right now, particularly given that President Trump is the person in the White House? Professor English,
because
maybe.
We're in Los Angeles? Because we're closer to a nuclear. We'll just no.
Actually, Alaska's a lot closer.
Yeah.
Yeah, we will suffer less from nuclear strike. We'll be gone quicker. They'll be suffering prolonged radiation sickness in the east.
Perhaps to put it with
which
less
is my
of a
way of
gloomy
saying
cloud. Yeah.
There's nothing special about if it gets to that, we're all in bad shape. No, I can't really. I'm sorry. I don't have a great deal to say about this. I just don't have expertise. But I was thinking, is it sort of fancy footwork if I can answer a different question, which is. I wasn't clear at the outset. When I said the grade you give depends on a template that we might not all agree on vis-a-vis Russia. And I'm not necessarily, in fact, in some ways, I'm clearly not, with the mainstream. The tougher we are on Putin, the better. The more we're like what Hillary Clinton would have done, the better with Russia. I see the need for and opportunities for greater cooperation. I see a relationship that has broken down to the detriment of the whole world, and that has, in our political debates, become so full of atmospherics and sort of Russophobic extremes that a kind of clean slate, there were things, as little faith as I had that Trump could execute it, were nonetheless, in the basic principles he enunciated, very bracing, very refreshing. Therefore, if what we've seen, as I apparently seemed to suggest, was Trump going back to that mainstream, it didn't necessarily mean I thought that was good, but again, where it leads thanks to these investigations, we'll take it out of everyone's hands. So let me just clarify that by asking us to think ahead. Because so often we have these very simplified black and white views of issues, which are much more complex. And also we wake up to them very late. What I mean by that is sort of unnoticed in the current climate, but maybe in a different, calmer time we would have paid more attention, is that we're about to admit a new member of NATO, a country called Montenegro. So the Senate voted 97-2 to ratify that additional member of this treaty organization. It is a treaty, so it requires Senate ratification. A lot of people, meaning 20 of us, I suppose, who are fairly expert in the region, have a lot of concerns about that. Montenegro, of course, again, with the mainstream approach, okay, another member of NATO, great, NATO should be stronger, that stands up to Russia. Montenegro is nowhere near Russia. There's no Russian threat to Montenegro. The idiocy about an attempted Serbian-Russian coup is crazy. It's ginned up by a local dictator who is more corrupt than Putin ever could be, who is more likely to kill or imprison political opponents than Putin ever has been, someone named Milo Djukanovic. And my God, speaking of double standards, if the whole reason we went so strongly in support of the Ukrainian revolution, the Ukrainian putsch or rebellion back in 2014 was because even though he was democratically elected, Yanukovych was so corrupt, then how are we jumping into bed and supporting this Djukanovic for whom getting into NATO is a way of prolonging his stranglehold, 25 years and counting, on the country? It's a really bad idea. Montenegro is ruled by a thug and a gangster. We have closed our eyes to his misdeeds. He's indicted all over Europe, principally in Italy and by the European Union, for running the largest international smuggling, clandestine human trafficking, tobacco, and drugs across the Adriatic. It's just unbelievable that we're walking into bringing this guy, this country, into NATO when it has nothing to contribute to NATO and has no need for NATO. And the rest of the world, at least those who aren't part of the NATO diplomatic elite, look at that and say, geez, and we take you seriously when you say you're fighting corruption, that it was okay to undermine a government because it was corrupt. And anyway, so why am I going off on this tangent about Montenegro? Because this could be the issue 2 years down the road. We were sleepwalking as things evolved in Ukraine. Then we discovered we were crossing a Russian red line, and we were thoughtless about that. And let me just close by connecting this to unintended consequences, having a strategy, not merely reacting. If anyone had stopped and thought that Ukraine was being subsidized by Russia to the tune of at least probably $8 billion a year in below-market gas prices, in purchasing Ukrainian industrial products that nobody else would, and that when we basically maneuvered so that Ukraine would leave the Russian orbit and join ours, we also, in a sense, took on its debts responsibility for it. It's turned out to be fantastically expensive. It's more corrupt today than it was before. All observers agree. And look at the opinion polls. More people in Ukraine today regret the EU association agreement that was ostensibly the reason they came out in the streets in the first place. And we're going to have that around, we the West, especially the EU, but America too, around our necks for a long time, regardless of the separatists in the East and any trouble that Putin additionally stirs up. But of course, we have made it so easy for him to do that by what we did in Ukraine. Well, Montenegro could be a tiny version of Ukraine, but I think there's a lot of not thinking through the consequences or going along with inertia or reacting without a strategy, purely tactical, on the part of the mainstream. And maybe on this one, I haven't heard President Trump speak about Montenegro or express any opinion. Probably he's never heard of it. But some of his instincts might have, suggested he would have been a little more cautious. This policy was in place, and it's just carried on. It was well advanced before. So I know I've gone on too long, but there are things happening and perspectives worth considering that don't make it into our normal media and therefore part of the debate that ought to be.
That's why this is such a good panel. We're all learning things. I don't know about all of you. I'm no expert on Montenegro, but I think we should stick to NATO for a second. Given what President Trump said during the campaign, that NATO was obsolete and sort of his, I don't want to use the word flip-flop, but retraction of that and reassessing it. I'm going to ask Joel, what you think about sort of how his campaign supporters are reacting to it. You touched on this in your opening answer. A lot of his changes and his decision, the sort of does America need to be involved in other places? That was something that a lot of people really appreciated when he was on the campaign trail.
Well, he said a lot of things about many different issues. On Iran, for example, he did say he would tear up the agreement, but before that he said that he would enforce the agreement. And I remember writing at the time that this was a really remarkable response because most of the other Republican candidates, he said it during the primary, were all talking about tearing it up. And he said, we're just going to enforce it really harshly. And now that's what members of his administration are saying, and it looks like a flip-flop. The truth is he basically said both things during the campaign. And similarly on a variety of issues. On North Korea, he was firm, but also did something interesting, not just North Korea, other countries as well, something that Obama did in his campaign in 2007, 2008, where he said he would meet with leaders of these countries without preconditions, which was a big target for Republicans in the 2008 election. And Trump said much the same thing about Russia, about other countries. There was apparently a covert attempt, or a quiet attempt, to contact representatives of North Korea a few months ago. Nothing ever came of it. But there was an effort by Trump to repeat some of these things that Obama did, perhaps on the belief that Obama just wasn't competent at doing them and that he would be more successful. And that was one of the things I criticized when writing about Trump's foreign policy during the campaign. But I don't think his supporters are really that interested in what happens week to week in minor ways. You'll find some supporters who don't like any kind of foreign intervention at all. They're a very small minority. You'll find more, I think, who are encouraged by the show of American strength. They're not simplistic in that they think just blowing up the mother of all bombs is a great thing to do regardless of where you're doing it or how or what the consequences are. But I think the idea that they were doing that above a tunnel network when it's next door to Iran's nuclear tunnel network, I think wasn't lost on people, and people like showing strength, and it makes them feel stronger. And just on the North Korea point, we're actually in Los Angeles. We're actually sitting in a community or among people who already have been targeted by North Korea. And it was the Sony hack a few years ago, with North Koreans hacked Sony studios, and through intimidation, basically forced the cancellation of the screening of a film in the United States. That's remarkable that you could not get this film, The Interview, which was about assassinating Kim Jong-un. You couldn't get anyone to host this film, and it's almost like what's happened in Berkeley today, where Ann Coulter has been forced to cancel her speech. But North Korea undermined the constitutional freedoms of the United States. That was an act of war. I'm not saying it meant we should have, launched the carrier group as a result of that, but it certainly was an act of war. And we've seen already that North Korea poses a threat to our economic interests, a threat to our freedoms, and they haven't been reluctant to attack us. And so what Trump is doing today, meeting with the entire Senate to brief them on whatever his strategy is, we don't know yet, we'll find out, but it tends to make one think that he intends to remove the North Korean regime somehow, or to have the Chinese do something. The Chinese warned the North Koreans this week not to do any more nuclear testing because they would reach a point of no return. That's very strong language. What does that mean? That means the integrity of the regime. So that's what we're talking about now. That's on the table. And Glenn Beck, who's a conservative critic of Trump, says that he doesn't like this idea. I heard him on the radio this morning talking about 1 million people will die in the first few days of a war with North Korea. So there is going to be some conservative pushback if it heads in that direction. But I think Trump has already shifted to thinking in a presidential way as opposed to a campaign mode, and he's presented with new realities every day, as every president is. And I think it's uniquely Trumpian to have this variety of responses to some of these things as they come up, whereas Obama was more ideological, had a very clear plan. Trump says, I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do. Obama was very clear about what he was doing, and as a result, our adversaries and our allies adjusted. And over time, they tended to erode some of our interests and our positions. Trump's position is not going to be as clear. He's going to reserve his overall strategy to himself, other than, we win, they lose, make America great again. But he is going to be flexible, I think, and agile with his use of different tactics. But on North Korea, I think there's something more important happening than we've seen in the past 2 decades.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on North Korea before we turn to Afghanistan?
Sure. There are 3 possible solutions to North Korea. Decapitation, which is incredibly complex and difficult to to accomplish. You could accomplish it, but you have no idea what's going to come after or what the consequences will be. A military conflict, which I think I would agree with Beck on that I don't know about the numbers, but you've got Seoul with what? 10 million people live in Seoul, within mortar shell range of North Korea, so there'd be serious repercussions and loss of life from that. Or working with the Chinese to finally really put a squeeze on them and get them under control. And the Chinese, they're conflicted, because on the one hand they don't want to see North Korea further develop and have the ability to deliver nuclear weapons, but on the other hand, they don't want an unstable regime, and they sure as heck don't want to see reunification of the peninsula. So it's a very challenging situation there, and I'm sure that, as with most things in Washington, we'll be reading soon about what that strategy is and what was discussed with the senators today. The one thing that concerns me is inadvertently, through bluster and tweets and comments, inadvertently establishing red lines that maybe you don't want to establish. And then you're sort of stuck in that situation about they do something or they cross a red line that's short of, successfully testing an ICBM, and then how do you respond, particularly given those three options, two of which are very unattractive. And so I think that's a concern. And the other concern is with someone who is clearly so unstable and volatile as Kim Jong-un is, and who comes from a culture where saving face is very, very important. You don't want to go so far with the baiting that you end up eliciting some kind of a first strike attack, and I think it's a very very careful balance. So I'm not saying this is a criticism of policy or anything. I'm just saying this is a concern that I have as I look at that situation.
Christina, could I just add two quick things to that? One is what John said about the senators meeting at the White House today. It very much remains to be seen how Congress is going to react overall to the Trump foreign policy as it emerges. You see people like Senator McCain, who'd been a stiff critic of Trump early in the administration and throughout much of the campaign, approving of his action in Syria because it smacks of something that's the opposite of what he'd like to call Barack Obama's feckless photo op foreign policy. So I think congressional opinion and congressional involvement in this question, and granting Joel's notion that the president has the greatest unilateral sphere of action in foreign policy, there's no doubt about that. It's why presidents come to like foreign policy. But I think what happens in Congress is going to be very important. And the second thing is just to John's point about inadvertently eliciting action you don't want to prompt. When Vice President Pence was in North Korea, in the demilitarized zone last week, and he kept saying, the era of strategic patience is over, he could not say what it was going to be replaced by. Mm-hmm. Was it going to be replaced by strategic impatience or, strategic intemperance, or I'm not sure what. So I think it's always dangerous to declare the end of something if you don't have in mind what comes next. And I think sometimes I would say the early hallmark of the Trump administration has often been to say, this is the end of that. But what comes next, we're not really sure. And I think you should, it's like the lawyer in court, you shouldn't ask a question you don't know the answer to.
It's a good transition to the Middle East, I'd say. So, Professor Brand, we could start with Syria or Afghanistan, really, but I think we talked a little bit about the mother of all bombs. They're going to be sending more troops to Afghanistan. What is the situation there now, and what should people be expecting from the next 100 days?
Well, one of the interesting things following rhetoric or following pronouncements about the Middle East. Of course, Afghanistan's kind of the very edges of the region that I follow, but there was virtually nothing about Afghanistan during the campaign, and maybe that's because there were just so many other hot areas, certainly, or contentious areas. But it's also been something that really hasn't been referred to since the inauguration. So in some ways, the dropping of this, I don't like the term anyway. This huge bomb, it came out of. Well, it doesn't come out of nowhere because we have this. There is this ongoing. This is the longest military conflict in which the United States has been engaged, and the attempt was under the Obama administration to try and bring this and Iraq to a close, and that was not successful. And this is the first time that major powers have been, sucked into Afghanistan and drawn out conflicts. The British had that experience in the 19th century. Obviously, very different kinds of ordnance available in those days, but still. So I don't know what the strategy is for Afghanistan. It's in the case of Syria, we were told during the campaign, and it seems to be being followed through on, that it was going to be the Obama policy on steroids vis-a-vis ISIS. In other words, the U.S. was already bombing ISIS, targets in Syria, and that that there was impatience on the part of the military that this needed to be simply carried out in a much more intensive way, and that would make it more effective. But we don't know what the strategy is for Afghanistan. We've already spent billions of dollars in Afghanistan. I think McMaster was there recently. Mattis was there on Monday. They're clearly looking into what the follow-up is to the dropping of this huge bomb. But it's I don't know what I don't know how to sort of anticipate what the strategy is going forward, because this seems to have come out of almost nowhere. In terms of Syria, I agree with what was said earlier about the fact that the reason that the Obama administration, at the time of, following the pronouncement of this red line, and then the fact that the government used chemical weapons and then Obama chose not to strike militarily, that this was part of Obama's view of the world, having we had just come through this dreadful experience with Iraq and no plan for the morning after, and so I think that made a great deal of sense at that time. We're much farther into this disaster, which is the gradual sort of destruction of Syria, now than we were at the time. And so the impact of that kind of a bombing is not, it's not all clear to me exactly what that accomplishes, because there doesn't seem to be a different strategy other than sort of intensification of involvement. And the United States has introduced additional troops, not lots of them, but I think last I saw we have somewhere around 1,000 troops in Syria. But it appears to be another, it's an extremely complicated situation. There are multiple parties on the ground. This is an intersection of a civil war and multiple proxy wars. And so yes, no one wants to see people gassed. But this kind of response to me seems to be not exactly gratuitous, but I'm not sure that it has more than just sort of symbolic impact.
It's also interesting to me because during the last 2 years of the Obama administration, there was a lot of debate on Capitol Hill about the authorization for use of military force and if there should be a new one related to ISIS, because the White House believed that the 2001 authorization following the September 11th attacks sort of gave them broad leeway in this. What is the status of that debate now? We don't hear a lot about that right now. We haven't heard very much about it from President Trump.
Rob, you're the Pentagon.
I don't think you hear about it from Congress either.
Yeah.
I mean, candidly, my sense is that, particularly after everybody just rushed into voting for the Iraq War, and it's now that vote was a key issue in three successive presidential campaigns now. I think these guys in Congress, for the most part, starting with Paul Ryan, are perfectly happy to not have to take responsibility for what does or doesn't happen in that complicated, unstable region.
And you'd think that as a general sort of expression of worldview, the Trump administration would be skeptical of the War Powers Act to begin with, and would think that this is well within their, following the sort of Cheney doctrine, that this would be well within their purview anyway, but don't know.
So Russia. Professor English, you touched on this at the beginning. There's obviously a lot to unpack here. Sort of the status of this FBI investigation, how much is that going to affect Trump's foreign policy? Anybody that would like to weigh in on this? But Professor English, if you wanted to continue.
Well, can I just say one thing? Yeah. Something he said earlier struck both John and me, and John, feel free to weigh in, but even if it doesn't rise to the level of a serious constitutional crisis or something that's directly linked to candidate Trump, the death by 1,000 cuts distractions of this can still be very paralyzing for any administration. And I think, you said one other thing, Professor, which struck me, which is that it's rare to have Russia this involved in U.S. domestic politics, except 65, 70 years ago, it was very much involved in domestic U.S. politics in the sense of McCarthyism and all the debates about espionage and, whatever you want to, the Rosenberg case and on and on. And in some ways, those debates, which infected our internal domestic politics, were crippling for both Presidents Truman and Eisenhower in different degrees, in different ways, in different times. And so I think if the relationship with Russia becomes freighted not only with geopolitical realities and consequences, but with the potential kind of explosive personal and or domestic political ramifications, we'd be looking at something that could be pretty volatile, even if the worst doesn't happen.
It's true. Oh, good. it strikes me as a conspiracy theory without facts and without a motive. I mean, what would Trump have hoped to gain from having some kind of a better relationship with Russia in the way that it's been suggested by this theory? I mean, another way of asking the same question is, what was there left to give away after Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama? I mean, they gave away missile defense in Europe, they gave away the Middle East, they gave away the Crimea, they gave away the New START treaty, which hurts our nuclear arsenal and does very little to theirs. They gave away various votes in the UN. I mean, what was there left to compromise on? You know, you have to look at the previous administration sort of wakes up and realizes that Russia is not our friend, that the reset didn't work. But I can't find any reason for the Russians really to believe that Hillary Clinton would have been tougher than Trump. And I can't find anything left for Trump to give them that they would want. What's happened now is that the reality of Syria and Iran and Russia's involvement there has frustrated almost every other aspect of Trump's foreign policy. And I think the Russians, as they do with every president, are trying to see how far they can push Trump. But I think what will end up happening is the Russians will dial back their foreign policy to try to consolidate their gains in the Middle East, and they will leave Eastern Europe alone for the duration of the Trump presidency until whoever comes after him, Democrat or Republican, they'll try the same thing again. I think Russia has a almost permanent interest in frustrating America's overall ambitions. They can find places to work with us in certain times and circumstances, as we can with them. But I just think that any idea that we're going to sort of solve this problem with Russia is naive. It's just, this is the way Russia behaves in the world, and we behave differently. And when Trump thought he was going to have a better relationship with Putin by speaking to him, I thought that was also unlikely. But I also think that this conspiracy theory that somehow there was this active effort, I mean, I can't see one shred of evidence for it, and I can't see anything that Putin would have hoped to have gained from it other than finding evidence through hacking that hurt Hillary Clinton under the assumption she would become president. In fact, one of the most interesting things to come out of the Russian hacking scandal came out recently when it turned out that, this came out, I believe, from the New York Times, James Comey was aware of an email that Russians had recovered of a Democratic aide speculating that Loretta Lynch would never let Hillary Clinton face prosecution, and so they were satisfied that Loretta Lynch would quash the investigation. And this New York Times story a few days ago suggested that that was the reason James Comey went public with his reopening of the investigation on October 28th, was having been already undercut by Loretta Lynch through her negotiations with Bill Clinton and through wanting to call the investigation a matter and not a criminal investigation. He felt she was reaching into the investigation itself and compromising the position of the FBI. That's the only significant evidence of any kind of Russian impact on the election, and it was counter to the direction that one might think. So far, the great crime the Russians have committed by hacking the 2016 election was to show how the Democrats were trying to hack the election. I mean, there were the DNC hack showed that the DNC hack showed that the Democratic National Committee had colluded with the Clinton campaign, and then all of the other hacking that happened has turned up this memorandum that somehow found its way to James Comey and the FBI. I think this is a useful distraction for Democrats to rile up their base. I can't see any positive result coming out of it for the country. I do agree with Todd that this could be, as you say, a public relations problem for the Trump administration, just as McCarthyism was a problem for Eisenhower, even though it ended up producing nothing in the end and embarrassing the Senator McCarthy. I think that this is a political cause in which some Democrats have chosen to believe, even though Obama administration officials say there's nothing there. And I think the behavior of the Trump administration, which has responded to geopolitical reality rather than hacked emails and WikiLeaks and all this other sort of stuff, has already overwhelmed anything that might have come out to show anything at all about the 2016 campaign involving Trump and Russia.
Look, here's what we know. We know that the Russians hacked both the DNC and the RNC, yet they chose to expose the embarrassing emails, as you suggest, from the DNC, but nothing from the RNC. My guess is that nobody in the RNC wrote anything remotely embarrassing, and so that's why they didn't have anything to show. If you believe that, that we know. Secondly, we know that the Trump campaign, starting with the candidate himself, was dancing very happily over these leaks, even encouraging Russia to, find those hidden emails, and fairly joyous about the leaks about, what was happening within the DNC vis-a-vis Bernie Sanders on the eve of the Democratic National Convention. Now, that doesn't suggest collusion, but it certainly suggests, oh boy, we got in Germany we would call that a Geschenk, a gift. Here, let's see if we can take advantage of that. We know that Vladimir Putin believes, because he said it on multiple occasions, that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Soviet sphere of influence. We know that prior to going into Ukraine and annexing Crimea and the incursions into eastern Ukraine and the Donbass region, that Putin's approval ratings within Russia were in the mid-40s, and that after he did that, they shot up into the 90s.
60s, not 40s.
All right, 60s to 90s. That's still a pretty good jump.
65 to 85.
I've seen things that suggest they were actually in the 90s, but we may have been looking at different things. But it's the same.
The Levada Center, the most authoritative non-government polls.
The point is, I don't think what you're saying is contradicting my point.
If it were a jump from 40%, that would be
okay.
remarkable.
From 6, all right, let's just say from 65. Yeah. The point is that that this sort of pride in Russia and Russian strength being back was a powerful domestic political gasoline for Vladimir Putin. I'm sure you won't disagree with that. We know that a strategic objective of Putin is to drive a wedge between, as you suggest, Joel, between the United States and Europe, and also between and among many of the EU member states. And just to kind of, keep things roiled and unbalanced. We know that he likes to have frozen conflicts, particularly in areas that he believes are part of the, zone of influence of Russia. And my sense is they had, and we know that he hated Hillary Clinton. When she was Secretary of State, she said some pretty tough things about Vladimir Putin, and we also know that his back really got up when Barack Obama called Russia a regional power. And it is not too far to assume that, or too far a leap to assume that with the hacking, with the releases, at a minimum, Russia was trying to undermine the confidence in the result of the American election, which they presumably thought would result in a Hillary Clinton victory. I think they got more than they bargained for, and they may be saying, be careful what you wish for, you just might get it, given the way things are moving. But because we've seen them do that in Europe, and they continue to do that in Europe. They fund a significant funder of the National Front, of Le Pen's party. They're a funder of AfD, Alternative for Deutschland. They have spent literally tens of millions of dollars on very effective propaganda in Europe, in internet trolls, and also through the media and RT and radio, trying to put out alternative facts in Europe, and the New York Times calls it the weaponization of information and misinformation that has occurred over these periods of time. So there may not have been, I mean, I agree, Joel, I haven't seen any evidence that there was some sort of collusion, but there's sure a lot there that is worthy of exploring. And if there was an intentional element of this was a massive, somebody called the attack on Sony an attack on the United States. Well, if that was, then surely this was as well.
Could I just, Christina, just to follow up and to not disagree with you, Joel, that there is no proof at this point, but it seems to me that the real question that people want to try to get at is whether the Russians had or have some kind of compromising information related to Mr. Trump, related to his business dealings, related to his financial indebtedness to Russian oligarchs or, you know, European banks or you name it, that they could have used to hold over him, and whether his jawboning in favor of their, you know, finding Hillary's leaked emails and everything was all somehow connected to that, and thus that he would somehow be in their debt. And in the, you know, dossier, whatever you want to call it, that is much in doubt and much disputed, that is kind of that's the allegation at the bottom of the worst of the possibilities. And I grant you that there's absolutely no concrete proof that that's the case. But if these investigations by the Congress and the FBI are trying to get at that question, that's something that, you know, these investigations have their own momentum, and they go on and on and on, and there's no limitation statutorily or any other way to seeing where those people might fall. And I guess that's the thing that is, I think that's why the story has gotten legs in the popular imagination, if I'm, you know.
I mean, that's an even, to my mind, that's an even more unlikely scenario and fanciful. It's almost like wondering, where Obama's real birth certificate is going to turn up and whether he can't be president anymore because of it. I mean, it's sort of, you know, what sort of compromising information would they had? That he had said negative things about women, that he had cheated on his wives, that he had defaulted on certain debts. I mean, all that's in the public record, and people still voted for him. I mean, his supporters were going to, as one put it to me, crawl naked across broken glass to vote for the guy. I don't think that would have affected the outcome of the election. There's a different question as to whether it would compromise members of the government. And, you know, all these people going into the Trump administration have to fill out these forms showing all their financial dealings, and, you know, people with drug convictions or alcohol problems are generally not given security clearance because it's understood that they're susceptible to behavior that could be used in blackmail. So there's a legitimate security interest there, but you could have said the same about Barack Obama. He had a history of drug use. He wrote about it himself. People still voted for him. I don't know that anything more compromising would have come out. He joked this week, he spoke in Chicago and said, you know, if my high school pictures had come out, nobody would have voted me for president. But there's a certain degree to which our elections are the Ganges in which you sort of cleanse all sins away. I mean, if people vote for you, then you're the president. I brought up this book earlier today, Team of Rivals, about Abraham Lincoln, which I've been reading. And Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's a great admirer of Lincoln, talks about how he very likely visited prostitutes when he was a single man in Springfield, and considers it very likely. Still number one or number two on the list of great American presidents. I mean, I don't know how much this information, if it exists, would compromise Trump, and I seriously doubt that it exists. There's evidence that people in the Trump campaign were talking to people who were close to Russia. Some of that was normal conversation, maybe some of it wasn't. But as far as what you're talking about, aside from this dossier, which doesn't seem credible, I haven't seen anything else that would suggest that there's anything remotely like it. And if there is something out there, presumably our electoral process will flesh it out in 2020.
Professor English is going to have the last word on this topic, and then we're going to turn to Q&A.
I'll try to be brief, and I'll probably sound like I'm on both sides of the issue, but let me turn to Joel and say there was something else that Russia wanted. You essentially said Hillary and Barack had given everything away that the Russians could possibly want strategically by their weakness. Sanctions relief. And we can go into some detail about that, but there's no doubt that the sanctions, and mainly the European ones, but they are, of course, contingent on the American ones. They're interlocked, and American leadership is important in maintaining the European sanctions on Russia, together have hurt the Russian economy a great deal. And without going into specifics of banking, investment in the energy industry, and so forth, that relief would be very welcome in Russia. On the other side, however, you know, we risk, I mean, interpreting that. I'm reminded of that Saturday Night Live episode where Trump is trying to be tough on Russia, and then there's bare-chested Putin holding up sex tapes, and suddenly he's soft again. This is, I agree with you, far-fetched. Really far-fetched. I could be proven wrong, and the investigations will show what they show. But so far, some of the, I mean, even if you took it, even if you believed that Putin had financial or personal information on Trump, to deploy it in this fashion is just silly. I mean, it doesn't make sense. Think it through, guys. And that leads me to my final point, which is Putin isn't 10 feet tall. For example, his influence over European politics. I think we do ourselves a disservice, and we misunderstand and maybe then misrespond to problems in politics, such as a populist, right-wing, nationalistic turn in Europe, if we keep focusing on Putin. Putin is like 1%. I have to disagree. He's not a significant source of money for the National Front. There was one loan from a Russian bank of a few $1 million. That's it. I mean, look at their finances. That is not a significant source of support, even financially. And look at the history of the National Front. Look when it's risen in popularity. Look how it's grown in recent years. It has to do with 20 other things than Russian influence. It doesn't mean that they're not trying, that they don't invest a little here and in Hungary and Germany. But what I'm concerned about is that if we focus on Putin as if he can marionette master, yank the strings and shape European politics, then we will pay less attention to the real problems that are adding to the support of movements or illiberal currents that we don't like. And they have to do with failures of the EU, they have to do with the aftermath of the global recession, and so much else. And of course, above all, refugees pouring in from the Middle East. So it's not to really disagree with you that Putin is doing these things, but rather to say, are they where we should focus our main attention if we want to solve these problems and prevent, directions in politics that are to everyone's except Russia's disadvantage? And I think that we've turned him into somebody 10 feet tall. He's at the limit of his capabilities. The thought of him invading another country. Ukraine was separate. Ukraine there's a Russian population there, deep history with Crimea, a very shady deal by which it became Ukrainian in the first place, and of course, a naval, potentially NATO base right in Russia's underbelly that made it special. And if we'd been paying attention, we would have known that that was a red line. But the Baltics, attacking NATO countries, come on, guys, look at Russia's economy, look where it is strategically. It's at the absolute limits of its capabilities. And that's why, by the way, sanctions relief and some of the things that Trump could have offered, in fact, are real gifts. I'm not saying that there was a deal there, but Hillary and Barack did not give everything to Putin that he might have wanted. So let's just keep all this in perspective. And yes, wait and see if there really is fire or just a lot more smoke and, unreported untaxed income, rather than real collusion, something bordering on, high crimes, misdemeanors, even treason.
Before we turn it over to the audience, actually, there's been some breaking news while we've been in here, something that we thought might happen, but there are reports that President Trump is likely to sign an executive order formally withdrawing the U.S. from NAFTA. Does anybody want to weigh in on the consequences of that? Obviously, this has been a political issue for many years and in many campaigns as well.
That will shorten this stock rally that we've had in the last couple days.
Doesn't that have to go through Congress?
Yeah, it does. NAFTA was a treaty that was it enacted by Congress is back in 1993 when Todd and I were both banging around the White House in different roles. And so, yeah, I'm not sure how you do that without having Congress. Maybe one of our professors knows better. But I think that requires an act of Congress ultimately. But by the way, he'll get the votes for sure. Yeah, the Dems will vote for that.
So now we'll turn it.
It does not. We have the answer from Mr. Schrum.
Now we will turn it over to the audience. There are folks with microphones, so raise your hand, and we'll start here in the middle. And please make sure your question ends with a question mark.
My question has to do with your discussion about a minor issue, Montenegro. Why, if Montenegro is governed by a corrupt individual, you didn't mention that he had applied for NATO, but if he did, what would be his purpose?
That's to me, I guess. I'm the Montenegro file.
No, you did, I think.
I think I did.
Yeah.
Look, if he joins NATO, the investment in infrastructure, military upgrades, new arsenal, training, all the programs will be a gusher of income for him. And it would be, in any case, a huge political boost to him and his party. But he has proved a master, he and his clan, that's the only word for the group that runs the country, at siphoning off even more than is ordinary from big foreign investments, big business deals. So number one, he stands to profit directly in ways that enrich him and his group, which means also strengthen his political power. Number two, he almost lost power. He was on the verge of being voted out. His Democratic Socialist Party, he's a former communist, by the way, that's forgotten because he's pro-American. And this allegation that a Serbian-Russian coup attempt, which it was more Keystone Cops than anything discussed elsewhere, just absolutely non-credible, was cooked up at the last minute, an October surprise, if you will, to change the election, to change the whole terms. Let me just remind everybody of one thing. I know it's tiny Montenegro, but it's emblematic of much more. We talk about democracy and the will of the majority. It used to be that countries joining the EU or NATO held a referendum, right? It wasn't just a quickie vote by a parliament, which might be voted out tomorrow and was corrupt because it doesn't take many payments to get a majority on an issue. It was a nationwide referendum. It was for the Czech Republic, for example, for Poland and so forth. No more, right? Montenegro never held a referendum, and all the public opinions polls show 36, maybe 37% of people support it. This is a country, Orthodox Christian, very close to Serbia, traditionally close to Russia, whose corrupt leadership is joining the NATO alliance for their own financial interests. It could blow up in our faces, right? We are supporting a gangster. And that's how he benefits. He stays in office, and he even enriches himself and his clan further by what is essentially a big investment deal. And militarily, on both sides, it's nonsense.
Let's try to move on to a few other questions. I think we have one in the back here.
Thank you. Climate change is something that hasn't come up in detail yet, and I was hoping that maybe Ambassador Emerson or maybe Professor English might want to touch on how that might figure into your grading of the president's foreign policy, and if silence on the issue is something you can grade as well, how might this figure over these next 4 years in terms of a strategy?
Well, if you asked President Obama, what are the 3 things that you're most worried about when in leaving office, he put climate change at the top. And the reason was because he believes the science shows us, I know we don't believe in science these days, but the science shows us that we are at a point where that switch is going to be flipped, where it'll be very, very hard to reverse where we are today. And climate change, and I mean, I could say 1 or 2 things, and I think we got caught on some of these other issues, but I don't. That certainly would be a part of a low grade, because it's also something that the United States can't address by itself, other nations can't address by themselves. It has to be addressed globally, and it's something that we worked on, I think, diligently over the last 4 or 6 years in particular, and so I think that's a huge problem and a huge risk. I used to say in Germany, if you don't like the flow of refugees today, just imagine the flow of refugees when we have climate refugees and people, moving because previously arable land has become arid. Wait till we start seeing wars over water. Wait till we start seeing massive flooding as sea levels rise. You just turn on the news this morning, the CBS Morning News had pictures, these beautiful pictures of all the glaciers. The icebergs in the North Atlantic, which are, the most ever at this point, at least since they've been measuring this stuff at this time, at this season. I mean, there's just issue after issue that comes up that suggests that's a huge problem. So yes, I see climate change as not only a foreign policy issue, I see it as a national security issue. And by the way, so do the leaders of the military. They absolutely, I had 35,000 troops in Germany. I spent a lot of time with the leaders of the military, NATO, and our forces in Europe. They see climate change as a significant national security issue. It's not just a nice diplomacy thing as well. So yes, you're right. Thanks for bringing it up.
Just to tag on to that, more of a question than a comment. The U.S. is, in a sense, with this administration, ceding leadership on global efforts to fight climate change and especially greenhouse gases, which, by the way, in the category of breaking news, maybe I'm the last to know, but I get a little bulletin from Scientific American News. I subscribe to odd things. And we've passed 410 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, another horrible milestone, and still rising. But what does it mean that if we're going to back out of treaties and no longer be a leader, China steps in? Who is China, of course, now ramping up production of green technologies, photoelectric and so forth, photovoltaic. Do we lose also economically in other ways? I don't know, but I'm sad to see American leadership, as mixed as it was on that, vanishing and leaving a vacuum.
That's a very good point.
Sure.
I have to
Joel has a
disagree here.
different view, my guess is.
I think it shows great American leadership in preparing to pull out of the Paris Accord and to end this dalliance with pseudoscience that masquerades as the climate change consensus among diplomats who don't understand science. I
think Angela Merkel understands science a little better than you do. She's got a PhD in physics and chemistry.
Well, I don't have
Sure
a PhD.
understands it better than I do.
I don't have a PhD, but I do have a BA from Harvard in environmental science. So I do know a little bit about what I'm talking about. The science can be whatever it is. You can accept every alarmist hypothesis. The economics do not work. It is fundamentally against the national interest of the United States to compromise our economic growth for a problem that cannot be solved, as you've said yourself, actually, without India, without China. And they are not going to do what would be needed to be done under a kind of global governance that would reduce emissions. We have solved the climate change problem. We just don't allow ourselves to say that. The United States is the only civilization so far, but there will be others, to have expanded its economy while reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. And it has done this by switching to cleaner burning fuels. And it has done that also sometimes against the wishes of the Obama administration, which didn't want to see drilling expand on federal lands. And the technological advances that are happening are enabling this. So the parts per million will keep going up, partly because carbon dioxide has a half-life of 1,000 years, and so some of the things we do today, even if we cut off our use of fossil fuels, would not drastically reduce that. We do not have the science or technology to control the weather or remove carbon from the atmosphere in that rapid fashion. There are possible impacts, icebergs, sea levels, et cetera. It is cheaper and probably wiser to focus on mitigating the impact of those things rather than shutting down our economy and costing hundreds of thousands, millions of job losses and undermining our international strength. I see the greater national security threat as doing silly things like converting our Navy to green fuel that costs $26 a gallon rather than using sensible fuels that will enable our Navy to do what it needs to do, which is to get somewhere quickly and provide a threat to our enemies and support for our troops. I think that we have undermined our national interest by getting into some of these agreements. Obama won't put that agreement through the Senate, so we've undermined our, or he wouldn't put that agreement through the Senate, so we've undermined our own constitutional working through some of these things. I think that Administrator Pruitt at the EPA, from a conservative point of view, is doing exactly what the United States should be doing, which is leading a pushback against this and leading a march towards technological improvements which can solve these problems while creating economic growth, while expanding prosperity for millions of people, including very poor people in parts of the third world who want to see their economies develop and for whom the quickest way to development that we take for granted is fossil fuels.
This could be definitely a debate for another day. And we have time for one last question, and let's keep it brief, please.
My question is for Mr. Pollak. I sympathize in a general level regarding your point earlier in terms that historical terms and analogies should be used with great care. But I'm curious as to why you think the American left should discontinue the use of the term resistance, all the while you get to use the word revolution to sell books. And also you've made analogies associating the University of California at Berkeley with North Korea. You've associated paying for sex to be analogous with sexual advances without consent. And let's see, I might be leaving some out, but I would just like for you to unpack your deployment of those terms.
No. I mean, what is the point?
I'm just curious if
So you
anyone
don't
on the
like
panel-
what I said? Okay.
No, I'm just curious, like, if you could unpack why the left should explicitly disavow resistance when.
Oh, you're free
used
to
terms
use
like-
it. In fact, if you'd like to use it, you can. You can go on offending Republicans whose votes you need in Senate states you need to carry if you want to win the Senate back. You can go on alienating the targets of that resistance, like people who are alarmed that a public figure can't speak on a public campus. Feel free to use them. I find them offensive. I was speaking in the context of what would be good, what advice I would be giving to Democrats if I wanted to win. And my advice is look at those 1 out of 6 Republican voters identified in the USC poll as unhappy with Trump's personal characteristics, but voting for him because they didn't like the alternative. Give them a better alternative. Don't give them Nazi-occupied Europe and riots on campus and Trump Putin 2016 and not my president. I mean, all of that stuff is about giving voters a better November. Trump spoke to Congress several weeks ago and he sketched a vision of the future. You might not like that vision of the future, but it's a vision of the future. Americans like to look forward. Americans like economic growth. Americans like optimism. Candidates in elections always paint a negative picture of where the incumbent has taken us and so forth. But what people liked about Trump was the idea of greatness. Democrats have ideas like that in their arsenal. They really do. And unfortunately, they have shelved them. They've put them in the back of the tool shed. And they're talking in terms that I think are alienating voters, certainly alienating people who might be inclined. Look, some of these counties that Trump won went for Obama in 2012. And
2008 as well.
Yeah, and you're not going to win those people back. I mean, but if you'd like to do it, you know, I have this argument with journalists quite often. You know, we often fight against, you know, mainstream media, and they fight against us. And so, but I have a lot of friends who work in some of these mainstream publications that we spar with. But sometimes I say to them, if you want to write my paycheck, keep doing what you're doing. If you want Trump to be able to govern successfully through a first term and maybe a second, keep doing this. But if you want to grow the base, if you want to expand, if you want to win back swing voters and expand the map, you know, follow Rahm Emanuel's advice in Chicago and find candidates who can win in the districts, which often means putting away the funny hats and talking to people about what they care about.
And on that note, thank you everyone for a great policy panel. And Professor Robert English, Professor Laurie Brand, Joel Pollak, Ambassador John Emerson, and Todd Purdum. I'm Christina Bellantoni. Again, thanks very much. There will be a 15-minute break and some refreshments in the courtyard there. Have a good rest of the conference.
Thanks.
Thank you.